Well, I'm here with Shaun Shelly. Shaun, thank you so much for being with me virtually.
It's my absolute pleasure, and nice to connect with you.
So I just want to, well, I should let you talk about your background, including where in the world you are. But I'll say that I became, well, no, this is wrong. I was going to say that I became interested in your work after I read an article where you're sort of interrogating the meaning of, well, what is a drug anyway? But that's not true. I've known of you, I've been aware of you, and read a lot of things that you've written, including something that resurfaced recently about a healthy use of MDMA and it being actually an alternative to SSRI use. But before I get way deep into the weeds or start forming arguments for you on your behalf, will you tell people a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and your background, how you got interested in this area?
Yeah, so I have quite a diverse background. I'm from South Africa. I grew up in apartheid South Africa during the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. Originally, I wanted to study medicine. I started that and didn't complete it, and got into business, made a bit of money, and then had a collapse of a relationship, which led me to perhaps place some undue meaning on drugs. And then I did a 10-year embedded ethnographic study into the drug underworld in Cape Town. That's the official story anyway. Ended up living on the streets for a while, on the fringes of society. And then I had a former employee who was a refugee from the Congo who gave me a shack to stay in. And instead of trying to find a job again, I just decided I wanted to follow my dreams rather than what everybody expected me to do, and started volunteering at various organizations while living in this shack with no running water and intermittent electricity next to a taxi rank. And then started studying again, did some psychology, did a postgrad in what they called addictions, mental health, been studying for an MPhil in addiction psychiatry as well, and hope to do my PhD after that. I've done a mix of sort of semi-clinical work in terms of counseling as such, and did some internship hours in a psychiatric hospital and an opioid substitution clinic. And then I volunteered to work at an NGO providing services for people who use drugs in a very marginalized community in Cape Town. And the idea was to get them to stop using drugs, which very quickly I realized was not helpful to people, and we weren't going to see them come back again. And so I discovered my own version of harm reduction. I didn't know much about it, and then started reading prolifically while I was studying, and established a little newsletter that I sent to all the big names around the world, and people started communicating with me. And then I moved to an organization that started the first opioid substitution and harm reduction services in South Africa, funded by CDC PEPFAR, and then got an appointment with the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Pretoria, where I helped design the community-oriented substance use program, which is the first government-funded program of the type in the African continent. In fact, the first city to actually fund a needle and syringe program, for example. And over time, I got involved internationally as well. I've been speaking to a lot of people around the world. My newsletter got me a bit of traction. And I just became more and more fascinated with the wider issues around drugs. And so I then realized that people who use drugs don't have a voice. So I started an organization called the South African Network of People Who Use Drugs. And in the meantime, I'd run a conference called the South African Drug Policy Week. And we got all the big names from overseas to come and talk in South Africa. We had David Nutt, we had Ethan Nadelman, Neil Woods, the former pop. A lot of people came here, and we interacted, and basically started changing the narrative in South Africa around drugs and drug use. And I worked not solely by myself, but with a team of great people, some of whom have been with me for more than a decade now. And I think collectively we've changed the narrative in South Africa quite substantially, including changing some of the laws and that. And then I did a short stint as the Deputy Secretary of the United Nations Vienna NGO Committee on narcotic drugs, which is an interesting process. It's an interesting organization, not something that I'd spent a lot of time doing, but certainly was useful on my CV back in South Africa. And now I find myself working between the South African network of people who use drugs, where I'm the chairperson. I sit on the board of a big Dutch grant for Africa on sexual and reproductive health rights. And I work with TB HIV Care, a large NGO, and also with the University of Pretoria still. So that's what I do. I'm pretty busy, as you can imagine, but also I always try and work myself out of jobs to bring up people behind me. And so I'm in a phase of definitely mentoring people at this stage of my life.
There's a lot I want to ask you about there. This is probably not the correct order to do it, but it's the one that seems like a priority in my mind. But what was it? You said you started an organization in Cape Town for people who use drugs, and the idea was to try to get them to stop using drugs, but you quickly found out that wasn't reasonable. And so what changed your mind about that?
Yeah, so what that was, it was a so-called, treatment center, drop-in center with an idea of treatment. And it was in an area of Cape Town where there was a lot of gangsterism. There was a lot of methamphetamine use. Heroin use hadn't really started at that stage. Out of the population that we were serving, I would say at least 60% were gang affiliated of different gangs. We had a lot who had been hospitalized for more than 72 hours for mental health issues, psychotic disorders, that kind of thing. Almost everybody was economically absolutely destitute or close to destitute. And most of the kids had dropped out of school, or most people, in fact, had fairly low levels of education. Some of them as much, could not even read. So it was a very challenging group of people to work with, everything you should avoid initially. And I just looked at these people and I said to myself, these people are using drugs for a reason. I think their use actually makes a lot of internal economic sense, and that started me thinking really hard about this. And as I was studying, I started seeing a lot of discrepancies in what we were being taught, contradictions and ideas that didn't make sense. And so I went and studied all these things in my own time. And I just thought, why not have a place where people can just come and be themselves? And so we developed a thing called the Contemplation Group based on some mindfulness principles, which was quite interesting. Mark Lewis and I were speaking at that time. And so we kind of almost deprofessionalized in a way. We had clinical psychologists and counselors there for the people, but they came along and they basically ran their own groups. They formed the football team. They came along and found a safe space, which they didn't have at home. These guys are living in chaos. They're highly marginalized. They've got no narrative histories. They're mainly brown or black people and have a history of slavery, absent fathers, because in Cape Town, that was a typical thing in the early days of colonialism here, where most of the children of slaves were the offspring of the mother and the slave owner, and the fathers were just absent. They denied knowing these kids, and that's influenced the community. And also we had a lot of people from very diverse backgrounds being forced together and classified as one homogeneous group. And so there was lack of culture in terms of the historical development of a culture. And just as they were developing a unique Cape Townian culture, apartheid came along and separated them, took away their houses and put them into land which was basically just flat sand, and then had I suppose the cruelty to call them places like Valhalla Park or Lavender Hill or Grassy Park. And there was no grass, and certainly it wasn't Valhalla, and there was no lavender. And they put them in what I call skinner boxes for humans, basically. So Rat Park in real life, and I just realized that look, to insist that people stop using drugs, so what if they stop using? It will be just for a little while. What really is more important is to teach them that there are ways of using drugs which aren't going to lead to psychosis. There are ways of slowing down your use or changing the drug of choice that you're using most of the time to get the effect that you want. And what is it that you really want out of your drug use? And so the question that I would always ask people is, why do you use drugs? And they say, oh, because I'm addicted. No, that's not a reason. That doesn't happen. You've learned to use drugs in a particular way. If you found something better, you would unlearn it in that particular way. Why is it that you really are using drugs? And then you find very solid reasons why almost everybody who is classified as addicted uses drugs. And that was the approach we used. And we found, when we tried to study this, we found ironically that people were stopping using drugs. And we didn't have a big enough sample of people who just moderated their drug use, but we certainly weren't telling people to stop using drugs.
Have you always been that sort of a first principles kind of a thinker, or was that developed after because of this issue?
I think I've always been a rebel or difficult. I've always asked the question why many times. I grew up in
2-year-old does that a lot.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, there's a guy who's kind of a bit of a guru for me, a guy called Ricardo Semler, who's an industrialist of all things, and he says, you always got to ask the question why 3 times. And he says, when you've got a kid, the kid will ask, Daddy, why? And you say, just because I said so. So then they say, no, that's not enough. Daddy, why is this? Well, because of this and that and that. And then the 3rd time, you just buy them an ice cream. Yeah. And I didn't accept the ice cream, To me, I want to know how things are. I remember studying medicine. I was sitting in the library, which tragically burnt down yesterday in Cape Town.
Oh my God.
But yeah, we had a huge fire here, and basically priceless books got burnt in the fire that spread from the mountain. But I remember sitting in the library, and I'd heard that there was this thing called the citric cycle in the body, and there was a thing called vitamin Q that was produced by some other cycle, and this one needed vitamin Q that the body doesn't produce. And I was trying to put these all together. I wanted to work out how all these cycles go together. And the professor came to me and he said, what on earth are you doing? This was the day before computers. I was sitting with those big computer sheets of paper, trying to draw this all out. I said, I'm trying to work out how this all fits together. It must fit together. He said, of course it does. And if you work it out, let me know, then we'll give you the Nobel Prize. Stop wasting your time. Just learn each individual thing. But I can't do that. I want to know how things work together, how they integrate, and how they have effects on other things, because we live in a world of complex adaptive systems. And if you change one thing, something else has got to change, and you've got to be aware of those consequences. So always, yes, to answer your question, I think I've always been like that. Wanted to know more.
And so in this case, it's like you were kind of obligated to a group of people when you were asking the why question. So it wasn't, you not only would you not accept the ice cream, you wouldn't accept the punishment for asking why either.
Yeah, exactly. And to me, it made no sense whatsoever to take people who are already struggling and force them into a particular mold. And that was one of the big things. I went to 900 NA meetings in my life or whatever. And I had a big problem because I would hear these really interesting stories of people who just joined. And then by the end of the first year, you've got everybody. I was once an arsehole because I took drugs, and then I stopped taking drugs and I'm no longer an arsehole. And that story is just not true. People are not that simple. They are complex, and we've all got different stories. And frankly, some people, I just wish they would continue taking drugs because they were much better. I remember one guy sitting there going and saying, oh, the worst day in recovery is better than the best day in using. And I'm going, oh my goodness, you were using the wrong drugs in the wrong way, my friend. There's no ways that is possibly true. Otherwise we would have stopped using, Makes sense.
So that story that people come to you or came to you with, maybe still do, that why are you using drugs? Oh, because I'm addicted. I mean, that's something that's a heuristic that you have to learn about. Like, that's not something that people just come to on their own. And so you were able, through just experiential process, to help people change their thinking about that. That seems like that's a tough one, because I do clinical work too, and I know that could be difficult. You don't want to tell people, no, you're totally wrong, but you can help them understand different ways of thinking about it through experience and dialogue. But how did you come about changing narratives at a policy level? Was that a different sort of way of changing people's minds? And I'm curious to hear about that.
Yeah, and that's the most difficult thing. So when you're talking to somebody on an individual level, I don't have any preconceived ideas about them. I try and be 100% present and listen to them. It's one of the reasons why I stopped taking notes during sessions, and I don't do any clinical work anymore. Really, I just listen to people now, maybe in research or something like that. But at a policy level, the challenge is that politicians are basically, by necessity, psychologically flawed, because they're supposed to be thought leaders, and yet, if they're too far ahead of the curve, they don't get the vote. They are supposed to be independent thinkers, and yet they have a whole political party telling them what to think, what to say, somebody writing their speeches. They're supposed to be, these really impressive figures that have come up with these unique ideas, but they don't get the opportunity to do that. So unless you're a politician with a specific cause, like a Mandela, or even, I suppose, Bernie Sanders, an American thing where he's got a very specific set of agendas and a calling almost, those guys will tend to be more intact than the rest of them. But the rest of them are really puppets who are trying to resolve this contradiction of appearing powerful, whereas actually having no power and being driven by the population or the community. So really, the idea is to change communities and the way communities think. And certainly, a few years ago, I remember driving from the airport somewhere, and there were people saying, we need to execute people who sell drugs in communities. And I was thinking to myself, this conversation is really getting out of hand. I hear the Philippines coming up. Why on earth are they allowing this conversation to continue? But these days, we don't hear those conversations anymore. We hear a more balanced conversation. And when I'm on the radio now, or interviewed on TV, I don't get the same pushback that I used to get. I remember the one guy on the one radio station just hung up on myself and Judy Chung from the International Network of People Who Use Drugs. They just said, you guys are crazy, and they just hung up, But these days, there's much more openness, there's much more intelligent debate, simply because I think that it's very clear that a different agenda is being served than the agenda of the community by implementing this very aggressive policing policy. We haven't won the battle by any manner of means, but we've also got a very strong constitution. And so recently there have been people, and all credit to them, from the cannabis debate, who've taken this all the way to the Constitutional Court and won the Constitutional Court case that says it is now not illegal to smoke cannabis in the privacy of your own home or to possess cannabis for private use. And unfortunately, Jules, who was one of the part of the Dacha couple, this couple that took it, he was murdered a little while ago, which was really tragic. But Myrtle, his partner, has continued this battle. And what people don't realize is exactly the same argument applies to other drugs. If you can justify for cannabis, you can justify for everybody else in the Constitution.
Right.
And the only thing that would stop that from being true is if prohibition caused less harm than the drug being available, But prohibition doesn't, especially in the South African context, it doesn't. It is very harmful, and the use of unregulated drugs is also very harmful, although I approach regulation very cautiously. But yeah, so decriminalization is something that has to happen in the country. Just from the cannabis changes in the Constitution, we've seen 150,000 less arrests a year, although that doesn't mean that actually there are 150,000 less arrests. It means that probably a lot of those arrests were people arrested and then released, this catch and release kind of thing, just to disrupt people. So I think, to answer your question directly, there are two ways in which you can change the policy landscape, or three actually, I would say. The first one is to convince communities. Start with small communities. There's a great paper by a guy called Cohen where he says that drug policy is actually more like a set of religious treatises rather than a political or scientific document.
Yeah.
It's like a religious document. And he says, you don't go and fight the Vatican in the Vatican. You become a heretic amongst the congregation. So I believe in that. I believe in working in communities and setting examples, because politicians have to change. The second thing is if those examples work, you then have a very good justification, and the community themselves will say, hang on, this is really working for us. And then the next community and the next community will change. It becomes a domino effect. And any mass, any sort of major revolution in the recent years has come from a mass action on the ground, not from a single politician always, you know. Although we know that some dictators can cause that to happen. And then the third thing is put people in front of people. I've seen radical changes in people when they've stopped seeing the addict as that homogenous group of people that they don't like, as an addict who's a thief, who's a this, who's a that, and they just put them in front of them and they talk to them. And I remember there was a neighborhood watch here. We have, because we've got a lot of security problems because of inequity in South Africa, we have these neighborhood watches, and they tend to be guys who want to be policemen but couldn't be policemen for some reason. And so they kind of weekend warriors, I suppose, and they can be very aggressive, and they think the law doesn't apply to them. And I remember this one guy talking to him, and he was writing to me about all these complaints about these people sleeping and dumping needles and that kind of thing. And I said to him, you know, have you ever spoken to any of them? So next time, just go over to them and speak to them. And so the next time he wrote me this long email explaining the whole story of this couple and how disgusted he was at some of their behavior and all the rest. And instead of pushing back, I said to him, you know, really well done. I must congratulate you, because you've actually done a great intervention here, because you listened to them. You can tell me their story. You've obviously listened to them. And I'm telling you, go and speak to them again, and they will tell you that made a difference to them. And he went and he spoke to them again, and it made a difference to them. They felt heard for the first time in ages. And now this guy's one of our biggest advocates. And there was a similar situation once a month a little while ago, you know, for about a year. Once a month, I would take on somebody on the internet, a troll, with a set of rules, and I would see that battle through to the end. And I remember in Safer Seattle, I think it was, there was this huge thing about needle and syringe programs. And I wrote an explanation to it. And I was so pleased to see some of the people that were actually vehemently opposed to it now using my argument to justify it in other areas. And that is a tremendous thing. When I saw a police general write on Facebook, listening to activists like Shaun Shelly, and he named two other people, I, without my policeman hat, have to agree that decriminalization of drugs will solve more problems than anything else. And that's a police general, you know, and there's a tremendous sense of satisfaction that comes out of that. Yeah, so that's how I try and change the policy landscape, little bit by little bit, and influencer by influencer.
It's interesting, because when you talk about being a troublemaker and, you know, always wanting to get to you ask an infinite regressive why questions, you might draw the picture that you're disagreeable in some sense, but in other ways, you could have taken a million things that this guy who was disgusted at the people leaving needles on the ground did wrong, but you ignored those things and encouraged the one thing that person did that seemed like it could have made a difference. And he felt, as feeling encouraged, he continued it. Yeah. I mean, that was reinforced in a positive way. And that seems like a counterintuitive. I mean, it doesn't seem rationally counterintuitive, but I think that's counterintuitive. That's counter to what people would normally do or handle situations. You know, it's just easy to box people out if they disagree with 99 out of 100 things that you're saying and doing.
Yeah, that's true. It seems counterintuitive, but when you think about it, it's not. And you know, I remember that when I sort of tried to change my life, you know, and got less involved in drugs and that kind of thing, I had some very strange ideas that didn't necessarily, I would certainly look at as very strange now, and became quite evangelical in some ways. But I realized that it was the positive comments from one or two people, despite these fatal flaws or obvious flaws, that really encouraged me. And in my sort of career, I have been tremendously encouraged. Guys like Stephen Rolnick, the founder of Motivational Interviewing, once wrote me an unsolicited email, just praising something I'd said. And Mark Lewis wrote to me and included me in one of his books in a section. And Andrew Tchaikovsky and Scott Kellogg wrote to me little things. Stanton wrote me something. There was a guy who I respect tremendously, Chris Arnardi, who wrote me one sentence. He said, "Shaun, you teach me shit." And those things for me, I found tremendously affirming and encouraging. And I felt like the kid, who gets his first guitar and he's watching the Rolling Stones, and suddenly you end up on stage with the Rolling Stones. You feel like a total imposter. That's a word I know you use a fair amount, that imposter feeling. And then just beginning to slowly own it, and feel comfortable in it, and then probably going through some very arrogant phases as well. I'm fully aware of the fact that my ego speaks way too loud many times, that I thrive on other people's affirmation, like most people do, but I think me more than others. And I seek it a lot of the time. But at the same time, I'm not scared of confrontation anymore. And in fact, I encourage it. And what disappoints me tremendously is when I stand in front of a room of people, and I'm talking about stuff which they patently disagree with, and nobody pushes back, because then I feel totally unheard, as though my messaging has been pointless. I remember I gave a talk about needle and syringe programs and harm reduction and that kind of thing. And I ended up by saying, so in closing, I want to tell you, I will enable people who use drugs. I'll enable them to get access to needles. I'll enable them to get more regulated drugs. I'll enable them to get purer drugs and unadulterated drugs. I'll enable them to use more safely, but most of all, I'll enable them to stay alive. And I finished my talk, and I thought it was a like really disruptive kind of talk, but made a lot of sense and had a lot of data in it. And there were no questions. And then the first guy who got up afterwards was an ethics professor, and he wanted to talk about how certain counselors enable people who use drugs, and that is unethical. So there was no direct challenge. There was just this other statement with no acknowledgement of what I'd said. Now, he'd prepared it beforehand, I'm sure, but surely there should have been some acknowledgement. Surely there should have been some academic debate around it. And I'll never get that. It's the same. Nora Volkow from NIDA. She never debates. She just rolls her eyes.
Right.
And that just irritates me, because that arrogance that you can't possibly be wrong irritates me a lot. And I've been accused of being arrogant, but I'm always prepared to shift my position if there's new data and evidence. So if you ask me about something I know nothing about, I'll listen to you 100%, because I know nothing about it and I want to learn something about it. I have no opinion on it. But if it's something I have an opinion on, sometimes I do come across as arrogant, because I haven't just made a flippant decision. I've thought about this with some depth, maybe not with the expertise necessary, but I've thought about it. So if you think I'm wrong, have a debate with me. Talk to me about it. Prove me wrong. And sometimes I'll shift and sometimes I won't. But that's okay. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be having those conversations. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be curious. And that's what upsets me a lot, is when people don't enter into that discussion.
Why do you feel like an imposter?
Look, because first of all, I think that being an imposter is quite rebellious. I think it's quite nice to be an imposter in a way, to fool people, but that's my sort of fantasy world, and it fits into my narrative of being a bit of a maverick and that kind of thing, and pushing back on bureaucracy or stuff that I don't agree with, and occasionally being quite difficult about that. But I feel like an imposter because I haven't followed the traditional academic route. I've done a lot of academic reading. I'm quite self-defeating at times. I finished my master's, except for handing in the final thesis 3 years ago, and it's finished. It's done. I just delayed handing it in, because almost as if I'm saying to myself, I don't want to turn this into a therapy session, but almost as though I'm saying to myself, you know what? If you become credible in the eyes of the academics, maybe you lose your credibility in the eyes of the rebels and the disruptors. And also because I'm quite upset with academia. I wrote an article with Mark Lewis for the New England Journal of Medicine, which has got the highest impact factor of any journal. It's 70 something, you know, like literally in the 70s. Most of the journals I write with, I'm lucky if they're 7 or 8, you know. The Lancet's only 40. And so I wrote this piece about, as a rebuttal to Nora Volker's brain disease model piece. And Mark and I worked on it, and I was on, it was my wedding anniversary. I was away in Vienna. I was getting up at 5 every morning, working 3 hours on the thing, much to my wife's, you know, anger and that. But I was doing this. This was a huge opportunity. And then when we sent it in for publication, it went through the first peer review quite easily. And then they said, no, sorry, we can't publish it if I'm an author on it because I don't have the necessary qualifications and gravitas to be featured in a review article in the New England Journal of Medicine. And so instead of not having the article published, I said to Mark, please go ahead, publish it, and had nothing to do with it from there onwards. It was edited quite heavily afterwards. But certainly a lot of the thinking was mine, and Mark acknowledged me for that. But it just angered me so much because, first of all, you're allowed to choose your peer reviewers, which I just think is bizarre.
That is bizarre.
And then there's such rubbish written there, you know. At the risk of sounding absolutely totally arrogant, I think I know more about people who use drugs and drug use than Nora Volker does. She knows pretty pictures and brains and her experience of her grandfather, which influences everything that she does. She has never once given me a convincing argument or made a statement that makes me think she actually understands the people she's talking about.
For people who don't know, Trotsky is her grandfather.
Yeah, sorry.
No, please. Well, for most people listening, they'll probably know that already. But
yeah,
when you say that, I mean, that's like after my own heart. I have been at the precipice of becoming a clinician and a teacher both, and have not gone through with the standard steps and becoming licensed or anything like that. So the reason I ask is because I feel that same way. In some ways, if my daughter were to ask, should I go your route, I would say I don't really recommend it. And on the other hand, there's something noble about being the kind of imposter that you are, I think, because you're always questioning. You know, you don't land in a field, and you're not fated to wander endlessly there forever. The thing is, I think that something that attracted me to you recently, which I'd love you to spell out if you could,
sure,
was a series of questions that you asked in an epistemic sort of dialogue. Or it was a thought experiment as you wrote it out, but I think there was a room full of people you were talking to about what is a drug. And that's the kind of thinking that I believe will get us progress, truly. Not academics sitting in an ivory tower writing papers about why the disease model is great or something like that. Anyway, would you mind telling people, because I keep trying to reference it. I don't know if you've heard any of my recent talks where I actually have referenced you and this thing. But I think I'm doing it wrong. So it'd be really interesting to get your take on it in explanation.
Right. So one of the things I'm privileged to do is teach fifth-year medical students. And it's interesting, when I lecture, I get comments that rate me very, very highly, or comments that just never want to hear me again. So that to me is, and fortunately, my boss at the university, Professor Jannie Hugo, who's a great guy, him and my other boss, Professor Harry Hausler, have given me a lot of freedom, and they're great people. And anyway, he allows me to do this, you know, to become more philosophical. So one of the things I start off lecturing the students on, these are medical students, by the way, they're about to become doctors. They're at their most arrogant, you know, they've got that idea that they're really competent at this stage, and they're about to find out that they're not. So it's the last moment of true arrogance as a student, I think. And so I asked them, I say to them, what is a drug? And, you know, you hear sort of like the clicks on Google going and that kind of thing, because they realize there's probably a trick in here. And they say, a drug is anything you put in your body that alters your way of thinking and behaving. So I said, okay. So foods are drugs. And then you click and they find another information there, except for food. So what about magic mushrooms? Well, and magic mushrooms, magic mushrooms. No, magic mushrooms are food. Okay, so magic mushrooms as well, but so most foods. And then I say, really? Explain to me then, what is a drug? You know, tell me properly. They say, well, drugs are scheduled and illegal. Okay, so what about cannabis? Is it no longer a drug? Because it's no longer illegal. And then you kind of get this silence, and then they go, you know, this is way too theoretical. We just want to know about drugs. And then in the article with Mark, I got, on Mark's website, I think, which is the one you're referring to, I then build on that. You know, I quote Derrida, I quote Becker, the sociologist, Siegel, Bruce Alexander. And as Derrida says, you know, in nature, of course, there are no drugs. There are poisons, but drugs come with a history. They come with a narrative and archaeology that is essentially a social construct. And so, in conclusion, I say in that article, I say, so in a rational world, we would simply have chemicals and molecules that can result in both good and bad experiences. In a rational world, there'd be no such thing as drugs. And if there's no such thing as drugs, what the hell are we treating? Now, that's intentionally provocative, because I want people to think about that. It's a bit of a newsbreaker. I'm working on a book with my wife called The Myth of Treatment. Because as soon as we assume that we can treat somebody out of most psychiatric issues and mental health issues and addictions, I think we've got a problem. Because we're looking at an individual, we're trying to identify a pathology. And what we're really looking at is the essence of being human. And that's what I'm trying to argue. And the second part of the article, which hopefully will be up by the time this podcast is up, is how this can have a practical application. Because a lot of the people criticized it by saying, you're just playing with words. This is semantics. My kid is addicted to this or whatever. And it's not semantics. It's critical. And I'll give you an example. A friend of mine died recently. Not a close friend, but somebody who was an icon in the field. And they always used to joke with somebody else I know about how when they're in palliative care, they're going to get the best high quality drugs. Anyway, they got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and a very short time to live, and they deteriorated pretty rapidly. But as soon as they found out that this particular person had been dependent on heroin from their late teens right through to their 70s, without too many problems, they refused to prescribe morphine. And I thought to myself, how cool is this? You've got somebody dying of pancreatic cancer and you won't give them morphine because in your mind they're an addict. What allows a doctor or a nurse to do that? And, you know, for me, there's another solution, which I'll talk about in a second. Anyway, they eventually did on the last day before this person died, they did give him that. But I thought about this quite heavily. And then I thought, if in the UN conventions you describe drugs as an evil, if we buy into this narrative of the demon drugs, why would you allow somebody to put a demon into their veins the moment before they're about to pass over into the afterlife? Now, if I believed in any of that, afterlife, heaven and hell, demons, if I believed in that, it would make absolute logical sense. I personally think it's really medieval kind of thinking. But at some gut level, especially in the Western world, where we've got this either Calvinistic or even Roman Catholic kind of narrative of Judeo-Christian kind of belief systems, where we might say there's no afterlife, but somehow a little bit of us believes there is. And we somehow believe in the presence of evil in a drug, then that makes sense. It becomes almost logical. And that is why these concepts are so, if I can use or borrow from those terms, evil in itself. The concepts are evil. They cause what I would describe as evil. They cause unjustifiable suffering and pain. Whereas if we can see these as just a molecule, the thing is, all right, this is a person who's been heroin dependent. They need bigger doses than anybody else because they've got tolerance to this. What is it that they want at the end of life? I'll tell you something. Drugs at the end of life make massive sense, you know, to be able to go home and take some ecstasy and be with your family in those last minutes, or find peace and resolution through psilocybin or DMT or something like that. You know, if it gives you added meaning, if it makes the transition from life to death, that inevitability, more palatable, why not? You know, and I'm not saying that. At the same time, I'm not saying that everybody should turn to drugs for the solutions to all their problems. That depends on the person. It depends, you know, for one person, one drug is absolute poison, and for another person, it's their salvation, you know. But unless we can get to that thinking that this is a neutral thing, and that there is no evil in this, there is potentially good and there's potentially bad, there's potentially helpful and there's potentially unhelpful, and we can allow people to make those decisions independently in a well-informed way. That is the world we want to live in my mind. And I've got a very nice little soundbite that I use. I say the world I want to live in is where people, most of the time, are able to make well-informed, conscious decisions about the how, why, when, and what of their drug use, or the decision not to use. And we live in a policy landscape that neither enhances the value of drugs or detracts from the value of drugs, because our current policy landscape, ironically, enhances the value in drugs. It creates a stronger relationship in drugs for a lot of people.
You're talking about drugs in a very natural way. I mean, it's just with no strings attached, no religion, well, faux religion concept that you have to tackle. So when you pull, you know, those curtains back and you say, what is a drug? You're able to think that way. And so I'm wondering, so you're saying that you wouldn't prescribe a drug to any given person. You wouldn't say one should take drugs. You wouldn't say one shouldn't take X and Y drugs. You're just saying these are neutral things. They don't have something living in them that make you, there's no ineluctable draw to them. There's nothing that takes over your brain, as we've been told. There's nothing that, you know, and when a doctor says, well, I'm going to choose this kind of a person in this situation, would be okay to give a drug to, you know, especially at the end of life, palliative care, and this person wouldn't. You might want to ask, you know, who made you God exactly?
Exactly.
Given the power to help people, but were you really given the power to tell people that they're beyond help?
Yeah, exactly.
So I wonder, do you have a concept of addiction, or do you see addiction in this as the same messy sort of concept as drugs?
So addiction is a perfectly human, natural thing. If you can be in relationship with somebody, you can be in addiction with something or somebody. So it's something that's also learned. So as human beings, we've evolved to ensure short-term survival. And we are constantly making these, George Ainsley would call it peakonomics, that peakonomic kind of decisions about what's got the most benefit for us. Now, the majority of people I see are homeless or close to homeless. They have no real future lying ahead of them. They've got no economic empowerment. Nobody listens to them. Nobody cares about them much. They're unheard. And so for them, drugs make immense sense. Now, when you see somebody, as I said in that article, sitting on the side of the road, who's injecting through an abscess, my thought is, wow, how is it that this is the better choice than not injecting in this particular moment, for example? Because if it wasn't the better choice, we have evolved to find alternative methods. We have learned these shortcuts. So what's very interesting is when you look at restrictive anorexics who have taught themselves not to eat, I'm not talking about bulimics, but they've taught themselves not to eat, their neuroplasticity is retained till much later in life. They learn languages much easier, they're academically very strong because they haven't developed those shortcuts all the time, because they are constantly stopping them from developing. Their will over their development or the pruning of synapses is incredible. We are designed to take shortcuts, and especially in situations where we're under pressure. So if we're walking through a big wheat field and the wheat is on each side of us and we want to go from point A to point B across the field, and we walk a particular path and we find point B, which is more comfortable than where we were, okay? Even if it's not the point we actually wanted to go to, we will go there. Okay, and maybe we wanted to end up at point Z, okay? We keep going there. And even when it's causing us harm, that path now has been worn and we've learned that path. We've literally pruned the synapses to make that an automated or habituated response to a particular set of situations. Now, you can't unlearn something. I don't know if you've seen, there's a great video on Get Smarter Every Day, this guy Destin, and he rides a bicycle, and he modifies it so that when you turn right, it turns left, and when you turn left, it turns right. And what happens with this bicycle is your brain just can't assimilate this information, and so you keep crashing until after about 3 months, Destin learns to ride this bike. But then he's forgotten how to ride the other bike, a normal bike, and he struggles, but he learns it quicker again. But his kid learns it in 3 weeks and can chop and change between the two because he's got neuroplasticity. Now, we learn these pathways. We don't unlearn something. We just replace those pathways with something else. So I this talk occasionally, I talk to people and I say to them, tell me what the description of an addict is. What jumps to your mind? And they tell me all the usual things, you know, criminal, unreliable, untrustworthy, bad at relationships, blah, 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 all the typical things. And then I say, now I want you to describe what it takes for you to remain dependent on your particular drug. And often, I only get to that stage, and as they start thinking, they often break into spontaneous applause, because when you think about it, it takes focus, determination, it takes structure to your day, it takes planning. Most of the heroin users I know will not go to sleep having just used their last bit of heroin. They'll keep it a little bit for the morning, okay? Methamphetamine guys, you know, you don't have the same withdrawal, so you use it all up the night before because you've got a plan the next morning that you're going to earn X amount of money and all the rest. But that in itself involves planning. The plans might not amount to much, but there's planning, there's focus, there's determination. The skills are all there. It's just the focus on the skills is not what society wants it to be, because most of these people don't have anything to focus on. And so I really like Bruce Alexander's conceptualization of psychosocial dislocation, because the very rich have that, and the very poor have it. And the guys in the middle, it's usually the people who've got some kind of stigma attached to them, or been excluded, or have been into the juvenile correctional system early on in life, people with mental health issues. They're the guys who are either trying to self-medicate or find meaning in something else. Stanton uses the term meaning a lot, and it's where you find your meaning. So Chris Onodi does a great little video. He was a Wall Street banker who used to get pretty disillusioned with the field of banking. He's got a PhD in physics or maths, I can't remember which, and he was a hedge fund analyst. And he started walking down to Hunts Point in New York and photographing the people there, and then telling their narrative, and they wanted him to put it on Facebook, and I got to know these people through his photographs. And he gives a great talk on why it's so difficult for people living on the street to give up heroin. They're giving up heroin, you know, if you expect them to give up heroin, you're expecting them to leave their families, their point of meaning, the people that protect them, that look after them, the one thing that gives them comfort from the cold. So why would they do that unless there was something better? That's why things like Housing First and that worked so well. You know, Sam Timberis's thing. You've got to sort out the system, and the individual will invariably follow to some degree. Now, that's not true for everybody, but it's very true for the majority of people that I see. So, in a very roundabout way, yes, addiction as such is complex, but it is very human. We are not going to solve it through ablative surgery, as some people have tried, even in today's world, which I find shocking, whether it's chemical or actual physical. There's a guy, Adler, from Stanford University, that invented a laser scalpel and went to China where they allowed him to do these experiments. And more than 50% had permanent changes in personality. I think that's unconscionable. I think it's disgusting. I don't know how any journal can even print that kind of research. You've got guys who are trying to, invent an antagonist for dopamine. You've got the guys who scream about Vivitrol. Just give people exiting from prison who are heroin dependent. And listen, if you can't control heroin in prisons, how can you control it outside? But they're heroin dependent, and you want to give them Vivitrol, which is an antagonist, which increases sensitivity on the receptors, and and then they're going to overdose eventually. You don't know what the bioavailability is all the time. They try and overcome the blockade, and people die because of that kind of thing. Now, I'm not saying that shouldn't be available to people who of free will choose it, but there are very few people that will choose it, and that in itself tells you something. And also, it means that if you have a trauma, you can't really treat the person with opioids. It's a problem. And I don't care what anybody says, opioids are great painkillers for certain circumstances. But what nobody's really gotten into is why opioids create that feeling of warmth, some of them. So if you give somebody heroin, they will say it's like lying in the arms of my mother and love at the same time. But nobody will ever say that about methadone. Why? And I believe that there are good reasons why. I think it's to do with some of the receptors that we haven't really examined, and the receptors that get binding with the endogenous opioids and early attachment. And so this is all relational, and it's all systemic as well, and it's all individual as well. These things live together in a complex adaptive system, and that's why I love the principle of drug set and setting, because always there's something you can change within those three things that lead to drug effect. Taking a drug does not result in a predictable chemical cascade. It has different outcomes depending on drug set and setting.
I'm with you, and because I'm with you, we might diverge at one of your last statements, which was talking about the difference in experience between heroin and methadone. Although that was a hypothesis you laid out, not a factual statement. No, I will be curious. If someone was going to design that experiment, to think about how to rule out when heroin's introduced. Typically just the way that we've constructed when people get the drugs and at what times and what environments they get these drugs. Then, typically people who are using heroin are, they're probably using it either to escape from something or, in some sort of a recreational setting. And people who are using methadone are trying to see it as an ameliorative thing to get away from their addiction. So I'll be curious about that. I'm sure you've thought about that. It's just that's the first thing that came to my mind. It's like, as you're talking about, as you're disentangling and trying to pull out from this medicalized model, that seems like that you could even go the whole way with that and not give an inch. But as what you say about addiction, I agree with wholeheartedly. And I wrote a book called Outgrowing Addiction. So it stems from, I work with adolescents in high school, grade 9 through 12 children here in the States. And nobody pushes back on me when I say things like, people will go through rough patches. People have difficult behavior. They have difficult interactions with things, but we can't take away the world that they might experience, but we can render them competent to deal with the world that they have to deal with. And when it comes to working with families and when it comes to working with teachers, just in a practical application, or school systems or whatever it is, people don't really push back on that. People say, yeah, if you know a way to do that, then that's great. But when it comes to drug use with that same cohort, it's completely different. It's like, well, The idea, of course, is that you could do all of that work only when they're off of drug, only when they stop using drugs. And then, of course, as it becomes to adulthood, that people don't think about humans as developing. So it was very difficult when Stanton and I wrote the book together. So when we were going to talk about people who outgrow addiction as adults, we thought it would be an easier route for people to understand if we went through the lifespan and talked about why children and adolescents grow out of things, and then when we talk about developmental psychology, we don't mean studying kids in psychology. We mean human development and how people. Yeah. And so, and you look at the data that show that most people who develop into what are called addictions or, problematic drug use, as people tend to outgrow them. And we say, well, why the hell does that happen? And as you say, you take a drug away. What are you supposed to do? Well, now what do I do? The thing is that people have developed a relationship with a drug or an involvement. And they've maybe in some cases, it's probably the worst case scenarios, developed a relationship that says, well, this thing that I'm clutching is the world to me. I need to seek it out. It's the thing that gives me consistency and pleasure and meaning and purpose, and the routines around it. Well, I could never give that up. So when you talk about the way that people don't really unlearn things, I think two things about that. One, if you follow that whole track and you believe it, if you were to grant it, which not everybody does, it's hard to get people to sign on the dotted line for all those things. I agree that the first thing is I agree that people learn things, they don't unlearn them, they just learn new things. The second thing is when it comes to having been in a dark place in your life, you're kind of learning in an enhanced way to people who maybe have not experienced those things. So not only are you not unlearning that experience, but you might just have an edge on people who have never gone through those depths. So if you put your money on people, this is the thing. So people have come to me with children who have all these problems, and I'm always so sure that there's a track that they'll be helped. And I think that people think I'm doing more than I am because I've bet on them. And then when they see through that this kid is excelling, they say, wow, you knew the whole time, you had a plan. And I didn't really have a plan. I just know that that's so anyway, all of that to say, not only don't people unlearn things, but they might learn more. You don't really recommend, hey, you should go through a horrible experience. But insofar as somebody does, maybe there's something to take away with that more than somebody else. So I'll ask you said you lived on the streets, and I imagine that, maybe that was partially by choice, maybe partially because you didn't have an attractive alternative to doing so. But I wonder if you have that experience from having, living in those times, if you learned something about that lifestyle that has helped you on your mission moving forward. I know there was a lot there. You can respond to any of those things.
So there's a lot there. One point that I just wanted to stress with you was you were talking about the belief that this kid is going to get better. And William Miller, one of the founders of motivational interviewing, he talks, there's the Archibald something or other lecture. I think it's called The Wood from the Trees or something like that. But it's a paper. And he describes an experiment in it where what he did was he went to one of these treatment centers, and they developed a recovery possibility scale. What are the chances of this person recovering? And they gave it to all the people, and they didn't tell the people doing the test, what their score was. They rated them 1, you've got no chance, 10, you've got a lot of chance. And then they went and they gave these scores to the counselors, but not to the patient. And they had to rate whether they thought that this methodology or this questionnaire was a good predictor of outcome. And the correlation was massive. Almost too good to be true. The secret was that the scores had been randomly assigned. So the counselor's belief that the person could recover was more important than any other factor. So, and that goes back to my original statement about when I was encouraged through positive affirmation. And that's the whole principle of motivational interviewing. Steve Rolnick and I've discussed this at length. It's positive affirmation that really gets people through often. So when I was on the street, that was the one point that came up out of what you were saying there. Your approach is eminently sensible in my mind. But when I was living on the street, what was interesting and what the big advantage I had, I was fairly privileged as a white in South Africa. You got a good education, and I had that good education. Even though I came from a very poor family, I had a very good education. And interestingly enough, I can remember many occasions thinking to myself, I wish I had a camera here, because somehow I knew this wasn't going to be my future. You know? And that was tremendously protective, I think. But if I had to relive my life, I probably wouldn't. I would change certain things, but I would struggle to justify avoiding those times, because they really taught me about people. They taught me about what's important. They taught me that from practical things like, don't give somebody living on the street a beautiful warm jacket towards winter. Give them socks and underwear, because they've got nowhere to put the jacket. It's going to get stolen. The only thing that it's going, or don't expect them to still have it a week from now. They would have sold it, because in the warm weather, what do you do with it? Those kinds of things. Don't take offense to it. Once you've given it away, you've given it away. There are lots of reasons. It's taught me, don't ask a person, do you use drugs? Because if they say no, either they're lying or they're the exception for the people that I mix with on the street. And besides, it's none of your business. Give them the money you want to give them. What they spend it on, they're going to spend it on the thing that's going to give them the most comfort in that time, whether the drugs or whatever. Those are the kinds of things that I got to understand. And it's strange. My wife was saying to me the one day, we were walking along, and she says, how is it that whenever you walk past people on the street, you don't have to make eye contact, you don't have to make anything, but there seems to be, they connect with you. And that I find really interesting, because even when I'm trying to be offish, because of circumstances or whatever, I'm in a bad mood or whatever, people will still approach me out of anybody else. And I'm a tall person, I'm 6'3", I'm quite large framed. In other circumstances, people are intimidated by me, but in those circumstances, not at all. They kind of sense that there's some experiential knowledge there. And that's incredibly valuable. I don't think you have to be homeless to do that. Somebody like Chris Anadi, who spent time talking to people, has really got it. Although we disagree on one or two things. One thing is, he believes that drug use is often a slow suicide, whereas often it's the only way of survival for a lot of people. If you look at guys like Chester Bennington and Chris Cornell, and that, they suicide when they're forced into abstinence often. And NIDA says there's a correlation between the two, but I'd love to see those VA figures at what point people actually suicide, because heroin in general is pretty protective. I know from a lot of circumstances that people who use heroin and opioids largely do not want to die. They want to live. And if they're prepared to take those risks, how much do they want to live? And how much of a duty do we have to solve that problem, which is bloody easy to solve, but nobody's got the will to. So that's the opioid crisis, which don't get me started on. Well, maybe get me started on, because that annoys me so much. But the point is that my life on the street, my life in clubs, my life living in gay clubs for a large proportion of my life, going out every single night, all of that prepared me for who I am today, and able to deal with these things. Our center that we were running in those days, I was very upset because a lot of people who identify as transgender would attend, and we were only had a retention rate of 50% there. And I phoned Dr. Gordon Isaacs, who's an absolute hero of mine, and he said to me, he said, "What, you've got 50% of people are coming back? How many times?" I said, "Second, third, fourth time." He said, "We've never had a single person go back to any center before, not once." And I thought I was failing, but it shocks me that how unfriendly must services be when people who really want services don't go there. That to me is shocking, and it just irritates me when I hear these things about, oh, these people don't want help. They want help, but they don't want help on your terms. They want help that will help them. There was a great statement in one of the research papers, one of the research projects I did. This guy said, I went to rehab, but they never had what I wanted. They never had what I needed. sometimes I think that the only things that I need are somebody to listen to me and perhaps an agonist. Yeah. And that's a beautiful statement because that is just what some people need. But yeah, then first, there's the rubbish about, oh, you can't work with a person who's still using drugs. Oh, please. I mean, then you can't work with anybody because everybody's taking drugs in one way or another.
Right.
Don't come to me like drugs do not change who a person is. They can lower inhibitions. They can catalyze certain things. They can encourage certain things to happen or put people in a certain direction, but they are not capable of turning a person into an absolute demon. That capability was there before to some degree, and the person hadn't examined those areas of their life. And we must remember that almost all sociopaths will take drugs, but not all people who take drugs will be sociopaths.
Right. By that standard too, it's like you could take 10% of American kids. You just shouldn't teach them. They're all on amphetamines.
Exactly. Yeah, don't bother teaching them anything because they're never going to learn anything. And you see, and now this is the messiness of it, because I, as a kid, was put on Ritalin, but on a stop-start kind of basis. And I learned very quickly that it made me feel good. Now, the interesting thing is, to this date, I've never touched a lit cigarette in my life. And up until my early 30s, I've never used any drug. Actually, except for one experience when I'd split up with a girlfriend and I ended up on a beach and some guy gave me some acid and I didn't even know what it was. And I just sat on the beach right through the night in the middle of a thunderstorm on acid, which was one of the most transformative experiences I've ever had. But I didn't even realize what it was. I had no idea. I had no drug expectation. But apart from that, up until my 30s, I've never touched a drug. Not because I had anything against them. I'd been drunk once in my life, I think, and this acid trip, but that was it. And then I discovered a way to cope with a lot of the social anxiety and with the dissolving relationship and with the desire to be recognized and to be successful and to feel powerful and that. And so they were attractive to me. But going back to the Ritalin thing, some kids do much better with the stimulant at school. They are able to learn better and all the rest. But at the same time, I'm conflicted about the drugging of children to the extent that we're trying to make everybody homogenous.
Yeah, because you do better at school. Because there's a set of principles that constitute doing better or doing worse. It's just a bugaboo of mine. People say, well, look, the drugs are helping them do better at school. And I said, well, how come school didn't have to change?
Exactly. So that's very valuable, and this is something where I'm quite flexible on it as well, because at the same time, I know that if you keep kids in a particular school environment and you don't give them the Ritalin, then what's going to happen is probably later on in life, they are going to end up more susceptible to drug dependence or finding meaning in the drugs, possibly. Because they've been ostracized at school. And it's not just one thing. It's not just the pharmacology. It's multiple things that lead to that. And at the same time, if you put them into a slightly different school, then maybe they would excel in that environment. And so this guru, the same guy that asked the 3 whys, Ricardo Semler, he democratizes his workplace and that, but he's also developed these luminous schools where you don't have particular subjects. There's a place which you can go and sit the whole day and watch and play TV games and watch videos if you want. But kids don't do that because they want to learn. That's the natural instinct of kids. So you have a lesson on how to make bicycles because you can't, and I'm quoting him virtually here, you can't learn how to make a bicycle without knowing pi, and so you learn things organically. And I find that if you put me down to learn stuff and to write an exam, I struggle with it. But if you say, here's a topic, write a paper on it, I will go and read everything on it and I will remember it. I'll remember which papers. I'll remember who wrote what. I'll look at the discrepancies. And so when I came to writing one set of exams for my master's, it was a real struggle because I knew what answers they want, but I find it difficult to write down the rubbish, So here's a classic example. To stop pharmaceutical drugs from being more addictive, they choose drugs with a longer half-life. So what about methamphetamine? that should be not addictive at all because it's got one of the longest half-lives.
Right.
So don't tell me it's not about half-life. Half-life's got very little to do with it. The dopamine hypothesis. You know that when it comes to opioids, there's very little dopamine involved. Just normal dopamine of, oh, I'm getting something nice. But it's not dopamine like you get with stimulants. You know, methamphetamines has 5 different mechanisms on dopamine. But they did all the original studies on stimulants. So they now say, oh, okay, it's the dopamine hypothesis. These people are just dopamine seeking. Not at all. It's so much better. You know, about, oh, it's about liking. No, dopamine's actually about wanting. It's about motivation. You know, read the experiments by Kent Berridge and that. You know, these are really interesting things. Why aren't you questioning this? Why aren't you finding the discrepancies? You know, when you look at all those brilliant brain scans and you say, but hang on a second, where's this normal sample? And does this fall outside the bell curve of normality?
Right.
Answer is no, it doesn't. So how can you tell me? You know, when I see papers that say moving towards statistical significance, no, you can't say that because it's not statistically significant. You know, and when you see a discrepancy between a behavior and some experiment or some brain thing, you shouldn't be saying, oh, well, this is right or this is wrong. You should be saying both of these are the truth. How can we reconcile that truth? And that's important to me. And that's why you need to have the experience of people on the ground. In South Africa, we've got some researcher who comes along and we've got this drug called Niobe or Unga or Wunga, it's the same thing. And Unga in Swahili means flower. It looks like Thai white heroin. Okay, so maybe it is Thai white heroin. It responds to agonists and that. But no, they've made up a story that this is a unique drug and it's got ARVs, and that's why people are becoming drug resistant to ARVs. No, they're becoming drug resistant because you're underdosing them by almost 2/3. And this drug is pure and simple heroin. When my friends come over who are heroin dependent to South Africa, I don't go and ask for a different drug from the dealer. It's exactly the same drug, and nobody's come to me and said this isn't heroin unless I managed to buy some flour by mistake. You know, so don't come with that story to me. Go and reconcile your story. Involve people who use drugs in all your research. You know, how can you research drugs without getting the input from people who use drugs? They're not rats. You know, and this is the kinds of things that really get under my skin. And I know I'm being a bit disjointed and sort of flow of consciousness kind of talking, but these things are coming to mind, and this is that kind of conversation.
It is that kind of, that's what I like. I love that. But everything that you just said is anchored in, well, okay, so you said kids who want to learn how to repair bicycles. We'll go back to that. Well, you can't really learn how to do it without understanding, at least conceptually, pi. Yeah. And so then the mathematics flows from your interest in something else because you have a motivation to do the skill. You seem to be motivated by helping human beings, and so at a first principles level of helping human beings, you have to sort of buck against bad research. So whereas if drugs are treated like they're parasites, and any new drug could just be called oh no, it's a double parasite or something like that. No. Well, you can't. Isn't that convenient though when that same drug or in a slightly different formation is, you say, super useful and now it's a medicine? So you're saying, well, you have to look and dismantle all of that because you can't help people without dismantling it. So there goes that's your imposter syndrome, where you probably have imposter syndrome because you stick to what actually helps people thrive. And so, yeah, I'm curious about that. Do you feel like all of your disagreeableness is anchored in compassion for people and helping people?
When I was a kid, I had a book, and I give it to all my friends when they have kids. It's a book by Dr. Seuss called The Starbelly Sneetches and Other Stories, and it's got a couple of stories in it. The first story is about the Sneetches who run around. Some of them have got stars on their bellies. You probably know the book, and some of them don't. And the ones with stars feel more important than the others. And then along comes this guy who's got a machine who can bring stars on the bellies. So everybody now got stars, they can't differentiate, and so he makes a machine that takes stars off the bellies. And these guys end up running around in this figure eight, putting stars on, putting stars off, until they realize, actually, we're all Sneetches. We don't have to judge each other because we've got a star on. So that's the first story. The second story is about the woman with too many Daves, with children with too many Daves. And she's got all these kids and they're all called Dave. And so when she calls, Dave, come in, they all come running. Dave, you're being naughty, they all feel chastised. Then there's the story of I think they're Loraxes or something, that one walks east, one walks west, and they come up to each other, and they will not go anywhere. Neither one will compromise. Nobody will step left or right, and the whole world develops around them. And then the final story is called The Pale Green Pants with No One Inside Them. It's about this guy that walks home at night, and he sees these pale green pants with no one inside them running along, and he gets terrified, and he hides. And every night he hides in the bush, and then one night he's hiding in the bush, and he hears this shaking next to him, and he turns around, and there's the pale green pants hiding in the bush, scared of him. And those 4 stories tell a tremendous thing. The one to me is about racism and discrimination, that we're all human. The other one is about diversity, that if we're all the same thing, it doesn't help. The next one is about compromise, that if nobody's prepared to compromise, nobody gets anywhere. And then the last one is about fear stops us from getting to know people. Fear is probably the root of racism, it's probably the root of discrimination, and that's why often you see when people who are closest to being homeless are the ones most aggressive towards homeless people, because they fear being there. They fear the future vision of self that they're seeing. And I think that book, and I read it hundreds and hundreds of times, and I didn't understand it at the time, but I think deep down inside me, in an apartheid South Africa, it ignited or caused an outrage in me, a morally justified anger at any kind of prejudice or exclusion of people based on something that somebody else didn't agree with. So I remember at school, I got ridiculed because there was somebody wrote into the newspaper, this was in the late 70s, early 80s, saying that all gay people should be put on an island off Cape Town and left there to rot, And I wrote this article just slamming it, as a young kid. And in those times, nobody came out, at that stage. Certainly we didn't have anybody who dared say they would go to school. And so, of course, now I was brand gay. I didn't give a damn, because even though I didn't consciously know anybody who was gay, to me, it just seemed that this is about somebody's sexuality and about their choices and maybe not even choices. And who am I to talk about this, And so I was outraged at it. And later on in life, when and it sounds really strange, in South Africa, I did not realize the evils of racial discrimination and racism until later on, until I actually went to the army. And without even thinking about it, I just did it, and I still beat myself up against it. My brother, who was younger than me, became a conscientious objector. Now, if he had the wherewithal to do that, why didn't I? So I think those kinds of experiences and the knowledge of the levels of discrimination and not being an active part of the struggle movement have fueled me later in life to try and rectify what I see as internal wrongs, despite my knowledge from a very early age that prejudice is wrong and that people are all people. And then it brings me sort of a long way around to the one thing is I try not to get involved in too many arguments, apart from a philosophical kind of argument or where there's a direct purpose in the approach people use. Because I firmly believe that when you sit in front of a person and you are truly present, you do what's needed in that moment. And so I know guys like Mark Willenbring, who's probably a disease model guy, but he gets it. He really, I don't know if he's always into it, but his system gets it. He doesn't do inpatient rehab. If you want inpatient rehab, you book into a hotel near his treatment thing. It's a multidisciplinary thing. They've got psychologists. They'll prescribe medications if you need the agonists and whatever. They'll help you with an aspirin protocol if you need to come with benzos, whatever it is you need. He gets it because he gets people. When somebody who's got a level of empathy sits in front of a person and truly listens to them, your theory goes out the window. My wife is a specialist in suicidology. She's got a that's a terrible term. I hate it. It's like addictionology, those terms.
Yeah.
But she did her PhD on teenage self-harm and suicide in underprivileged and under-resourced communities. And the interesting thing is, although she tried very hard not to make this an intervention, all the participants said the most valuable thing that's happened to them, the thing that's most protective, is the sessions with her, because she wasn't trying to do something. At the same time, they asked, what made the big difference? You remembered what tea would make me a cup of tea. You made me a cup of tea. Nobody's ever made me a cup of tea. You remembered what biscuits I liked. You kept some of those chips for me. These kinds of things, these are what make a difference. And the more you professionalize and industrialize and production line the process of helping people and trying to treat people, the more you lose the essence of what's being helpful is.
There's an issue that people have that I've talked at length with a lot of people about, and people have different ways of dealing with it. So let's just go like with, let's say that someone's a therapist. There's initially someone's going to a therapist or someone who's doing clinical work for help, and they're probably paying money, or at least that person's getting money. And so there's a sense maybe from the person seeking the help that they want the help to justify the money being paid. And then from the clinician, of course, there's that worry that that person is thinking that maybe projected, but then also, the wanting to do the help that's going to justify the payment. And so there's a bad idea that doing something is always just better than doing nothing. Or in other words, giving advice that translates poorly, because you're never doing nothing. As you say, listening is not nothing, it's everything. Yeah. But that translates poorly into, you need to give some sort of advice rather than simply be silent or quiet or listening or involved. Have you had interactions like that, or have you had conversations about how to reconcile that difficulty?
Yeah. So first thing, the doing nothing sometimes is literally doing nothing, because I remember there was this young adults came in to see me at one stage at the insistence of their parents, and they were just not happy. So we sat down and said, listen, what are your choices here? Are you here out of your own free choice? No, I'm not. But what's going to happen if you walk out of the room now? My mother says she's going to take me to the police. I said, do you believe that? Yes, I believe that. I said, okay. So that's not really an option, because we don't want you going to the police. You don't want help. You don't want to talk to me. I said, okay. So your mother's expecting us to be 45 minutes. Let's just sit here for 45 minutes, and I will do something else. If you want to raise the subject with me, if you want to read a book, whatever, do that. And 15 minutes later, the person's talking to me, and we're having a casual conversation. And they came back for the second time, and the mother's happy. And then because the mother now trusts me, some people would say that's colluding with the client. And it is. Because what else are you supposed to do except collude with clients? You're on their side. You're not helping them commit a crime or anything like that. You're just giving them what they need in that moment, which is respite. That particular case. At other times, that would be grossly irresponsible to do. But with that particular case, that was what was needed. And then I had a very interesting discussion, and they would probably be surprised about it. Dr. Nicole Lee, who works in Australia with stimulant use, and we were on an international experts panel or grouping on stimulant use. She said to me the one day after I'd given a brief talk, she said, "Oh, don't tell me you're one of those people who says the relationship's everything." So I said, "Well, the relationship is everything." She says, "Yes, but what do you do with young clinicians who know nothing?" And that's why I like motivational interviewing, because motivational interviewing gives you a structure. It's both directive. So it doesn't mean that you don't have confrontation, Yes, you avoid confrontation at certain stages, but when you trust somebody, you can be very confrontational with them. You can give them very direct advice. As long as you're giving it in their interest and allowing them to go back to those first principles that you talk about, because I'm a firm believer in first principles. We sort of like take this as fact and then build from there. We shouldn't. We should be saying, what are the truths? What are the things that we know that we can build this on? It doesn't mean reinventing everything. It just means doing that check on your heuristics and saying, does this make real sense? What's the common sense test of this?
So building on that, so if you're my clinician, I'm seeing you for the first time. First of all, there's going to be a fear. There's going to be a tension that if I disclose something to you, that you're going to do something with it. So if I say two things that seem incompatible, and you say, "Oh, that's interesting. You said this and you said this. They don't seem to align. How do you reconcile that?" I'm not likely. I'm less likely if it's the first time we've ever met to give you my real answer, to actually do the thinking and try to resolve it, or say, you know what, you're right, or something like that. But if we had a relationship and I knew with at least some sort of degree of moral certainty that you were operating in good faith, then of course, I'll go ahead and be open and make that connection. So it's a connection I wouldn't have made otherwise.
Yeah. So that's interesting because the 5 principles of motivational interviewing, one of them is develop discrepancy. And when I was speaking to one of the founders, Steve Ronick, about it, he said to me, be careful of using that, especially early on, because it can be very manipulative. And I know that I used to do a lot of training for nurses in a maternity clinic. And I used to say to them, do you believe that these mothers who may be using drugs at the same time during their pregnancy really don't want to love their children? And there was a useful place to develop the discrepancy. But in front of the mother, if you say, on one hand, you say you love your child, but on the other hand, you're using drugs, that's very punitive. But if they say, I feel terrible that I'm using drugs and harming my child, and they're just getting beaten down on themselves, then you can say to them, but you're here. That means that you really want to do something to help your child. And that whole tone, that whole difference is how you wield the axe. Is it an axe? Do you turn the feather into an axe? Because you can do that. You can manipulate people truly by using these techniques. But motivational interviewing gives you the space. And look, the 1,500 randomized controlled trials on it, okay, in various fields. It's the most researched intervention. And all it simply is teaching you how to have a sensible conversation with somebody. We lack that ability often. And so that gives us the structure to not do harm, and it gives us a base to work off. And to me, those tools come quite naturally. For a lot of people, they don't. And that's your safety mechanism. That's the thing that can actually help you really help people. And to me, my biggest problem at the moment is I will see somebody who's done something absolutely terrible, and I think to myself, what happened in their life to enable them to do this? And sometimes they're just absolute sociopaths. And then I, get over the sympathy part of it, but you still try to help them.
Because if someone is truly a sociopath, then okay, so here's talk about stream of consciousness. I'll let you off the hook in a few minutes. I have 2 concepts now that I had one, now I have 2 that I'd like to rattle off. This is something I've thought a lot about recently. Stanton and I often discuss, now we just started a podcast together, so we discuss these sort of like taboo sounding topics. Like, so one of them being, how would you work clinically with a sociopath, a psychopath, and why would you? And it's like, well, even if you're because you want to build people up to do the best they can in the world, I think. So a sociopath might have strange seeming motives, I mean, by definition, but they could still do something to be productive in the world, if not for them, then for other people, but hopefully for them. They could structure their incentives so that they could do well, and by some definition. And I'm wondering if you think about that ever.
Yeah. So there's a colleague in Cape Town who's a forensic psychiatrist, and he often says that his own sociopathic nature is what enables him to do the work, and he uses it in a pro-social way. But with the sociopath, there's usually a level of narcissism in it. And so that if a sociopath learns that I'm judged by the rest of society, or I'm seen as successful based on my empathy for other people, they will fake empathy, which is better than not having any, sometimes that might swing, but you can teach people to judge themselves by pro-social behaviors in a way. So I'm not saying that you can't work with any sociopaths, but it's challenging. And I mean, I got caught out by one person really, really badly. It still kind of haunts me, and it had some very, very bad results, tragic results. Because I identified with this person, there was undoubtedly a level of counter-transference, and I thought they were less dangerous than they were, but they were hugely dangerous. Interesting enough, they still occasionally seek me out and call centers where I'm working and that kind of thing. And I've been chastised before for refusing to work with them, but I won't. I just can't. I can't bring myself to it. It would be unfair on everybody, including that person, actually. So I think it's challenging working with sociopaths, and I emphasize here that I'm not a clinical psychologist who's got all the insights. I think I've read a lot. My wife's a PhD with clinical psychology. We've often used to read in bed, the psychology textbooks to each other, like about sociopaths and that kind of thing. It's something that interests me quite a bit. I think possibly I'm quite narcissistic and have some potentially sociopathic tendencies, but I've got a lot of empathy. So, that's the debate, but I'm aware of these things in myself. So I find them fascinating. They're the dark side for me. To answer your question more directly, or comment on your statement more directly, yes, I think that what you're saying is you can work with sociopaths in a way to reframe things, a little bit. That will certainly improve their behavior towards other people. Of course, they can just go and become bankers, and then they satisfy all their needs and wreak havoc on the rest of the world. And people will still say, "Oh, shame, it wasn't their fault." But that's another discussion.
There's I don't know if you're familiar with the psychologist Paul Bloom. He teaches at Yale, and he wrote a book fairly recent, the last 5 years at least, with a provocative title called "Against Empathy."
Okay.
It seems like it's ringing a bell, but
I thought you were going to talk about the one, how to unleash your inner psychopath or something.
No, but on the topic of sociopathy, and then on the other hand, empathy. Have you ever seen that empathy? I could tell you about Paul's thesis, but it's enough to say that he sees that empathy can go too far. People can have empathy to the extent that it can be tragic for them and other people, which sounds counterintuitive, but it's maybe semantics. Have you ever seen that there are levels of empathy that people have that either disrupt themselves or other people because they over rely on that whatever you call it, temperamental feature?
Yeah. So that's what I was kind of alluding to early on is, when I see somebody and I'm wondering what happened in their life to lead them here, I think that when you're being exposed to a lot of stuff like this, you can sometimes not forgive people, but you can move away from people having to accept responsibility.
Drink too much of the empathy Kool-Aid. Yeah.
So I think Bloom talks about compassion, which in some ways is better than empathy. So that's interesting because compassion, empathy. There's a book by a guy, John, I'll think of the name in a second, called Even the Dogs. And it's the most, for me, the most beautifully written book I've read in many, many years. It's about a guy who gets found dead in his council home in the UK, and he's died from alcohol-related issues. And there's this group of, you are part of a group of almost spirits looking on this thing over the days between his death and the end of the hearing or the inquest on his death. And he's got a daughter who they tell her kind of life story, and she's heroin dependent. She's got all these friends who are heroin dependent. There's a scene of this poor guy who's desperate, and this kid comes along and gives him junk, takes his money and gives him not heroin, and the guy is on crutches because he's lost his legs in the war and that. And this book is written with such compassion, without being harsh or without being syrupy sweet or without ignoring the ugliness of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
So that, you know, and I think that empathy can become too much like you know, flowing and just like, you know, fight and like sickly sweet.
Make it all better. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, and that I think is awful. You know, you turn everybody into a victim. In fact, the last line of this book is, "And we all rose. What else could we do? We fucking rose." And that the dignity, and Chris Arnotti's book actually is called Dignity. It's about the homeless people in New York and Hunts Point and all around America. He went from McDonald's to interview people who were sort of like discarded by society. And it's called Dignity because there is a dignity. And when you become overly empathetic and sympathetic towards people, there's a danger in it, in that you're insulting them, first of all, but also that you begin to justify the unjustifiable. And you must never forget that other people are suffering in these things, these situations. You know, the guy who's, you know, stealing everything from his family. You know, I don't have a level of empathy for that because I think it's just, you know, in that moment, although it's not maybe something you do every day, at that moment you're being a dickhead. You know, whether you're on drugs, whether you're addicted or not. You know, don't do that. You know, I don't have the level of empathy that some people do. You know, that say, "Oh, Shane, it's because he's addicted to drugs." No, it's because he's being an arsehole in that moment. You know, doesn't mean they can't change. Doesn't mean they would do it, you know, to get a McDonald's burger. You know, but heroin's a bigger driver than McDonald's burger. It's part of survival. You know, they make different decisions, but it's not the demon drug talking. It's the individual and trying to resolve a particular situation they're in.
So you can have the humility to work with people to improve, and nothing disqualifies them. That's, you know, very few things, I suppose, disqualifies them from being the kind of people who you can help improve. And on the other hand, you punish the sin, not the sinner. You know, so something that somebody does that's harming others or whatever, that's you don't say, well, that's okay.
Yeah. Well, I like Howard Becker's thing of, you know, what is a deviant? You know, so somebody who's got a different set of rules to you. You know, but they've still got rules. And I think sociopaths or as we know, psychopaths, they've got only their own set of rules. They don't consider anybody else. And I don't have much empathy for that kind of behavior. You know, but no. I believe that we have a responsibility to try and help people live a life that has some meaning, but without taking everybody with them.
It was great talking with you, and we're doing like a self-correction sometimes, saying that too much of a stream of consciousness, but I thought the things you were saying are beautiful. You weave in good imagery and, you know, good rational thought. It's good. This is good discourse, and I think that you're the kind of person who wants people to challenge your way of thinking or describing things, and not just because you're thick-skinned and up for the conflict, but because that helps you learn. You mentioned you listened to a few of or maybe one of the interviews I did with Anthony Magnabosco, who does street epistemology, and that's one of the things he said. He went out and, you know, he would have these discussions with people. This ties into motivational interviewing too, and he sort of set up the frame where he's helping them discover something about themselves. Yeah. Whereas after doing it long enough, he realized that you can't. There's something in poor taste about that. If what you think you're doing is helping people understand themselves, there's sort of like a mentor role that he's actually found out. You have to be up for the person describing their belief system in such a way that you say, oh shit, that now I have to challenge my own beliefs and really be open for it. You strike me as that kind of person. So just want to say that, flag that and say I appreciate it.
Thank you. I take that as a huge compliment. If I can just say one thing, you know, you asked me about people coming to you and doing nothing and what you do for them.
Yeah.
And I think that everybody's got within themselves a large degree of self-resolution and healing. But Mark Lewis puts it beautifully when he says, you provide a temporary scaffolding to support a vision of future self until they can grow into it. I think that's a beautiful image. You give hope and you provide some structure and some direction according to that particular person's needs, the scaffolding that they need. And I think that's the best you can do.
Excellent. Shaun, how do I direct people to your work, either most recent or in the archives?
Well, there's about to be a website going up named narcissisticallyshaunShelly.com. But that's in anticipation of a book coming out at the end of next year or the year after. Otherwise, Twitter, Shaun.Shelly, and it's Shelly, SHELLY, not with the second Y, like some people put, and then Shaun, SHAUN. So Shaun.Shelly at, that's my Twitter thing, at Shaun Shelly. And then, yeah, there'll be a website going up soon, ShaunShelly.com. It should be up before this podcast's up in its sort of rudimentary format. It's pretty, yeah. Sometimes I procrastinate, but I'll try not to.
Yeah, me too.
Otherwise, on Mark's website, Mark Lewis's website, there's some stuff there as well.
I'll link to all the things that I just... What's that?
Otherwise, just Google me.
Yeah.
Stuff comes up, yeah.
I'll put those links in the show notes, and I'm going to try to link to everything that I discussed of yours that I've read also that we discussed in the episode. So you'll just have to flag it if I miss anything. Shaun, thank you so much for making time for this. It's been a pleasure talking to you, truly.
So it's been an absolute pleasure, and I love these opportunities. I just hope I haven't bored too many people, but thanks, Zach.